The thread that never broke. There was always something in the way the world slowed when they locked eyes. Even when years rolled on, careers rose and fell, and the weight of time left its fingerprints across their faces. Something invisible, yet unshakable, clung to the space between Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves. Something too quiet for headlines, too sacred for tabloids. The world had forgotten about them as a pair, choosing instead to worship fleeting scandals and younger flames. But what no one saw, what even they didn't admit to themselves for the longest time, was that fate never really let go of either of them. Not in the way that mattered. It had been 13 years since they'd last stood face to face, not on a film set, not on a press tour, not in a staged reunion for cameras or fans. 13 whole years of drifting. Some of it intentional, most of it just the result of life pulling them in opposite directions. She had found herself lost in motherhood, in silent grief after losing someone close, and in the deep, echoing walls of solitude that fame often built around a heart like a prison. He had wandered, too, through the fog of heartbreaks, tragic loss, and long motorcycle rides into nothingness. He had become a myth, even to himself. And still, neither of them ever truly closed that invisible door between them. They simply left it ajar. The invitation came in the form of a handwritten note, not an email, not a phone call, not a manager's polite RSVP request, just ink on paper. For the ones who meant something and never said enough, it read. At the bottom, a date and location, Sonoma Valley, private vineyard, 5 p.m. The handwriting, unmistakably hers. Slanted, confident, but with a touch of sadness that bled through the loops and curves. She had hosted a foundation gala for silent trauma victims, an event meant to heal others, but part of her secretly hoped it would also mend something within herself. She wasn't even sure he'd come. She had written the letter 3 times, thrown away 2, and mailed the 3rd without breathing. And then she waited. The vineyard was hushed in golden silence when Keanu arrived. He didn't come in through the red carpet entrance or the press corridor. He walked around the long back trail, under trees, whispering with late autumn wind, with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat and his heart louder than his footsteps. From a distance he saw her, not in a gown or under stage lights, but barefoot on the dewy grass, holding a single flute of champagne, her back turned, lost in a gaze toward the hills. She looked exactly like he remembered her from 100 moments that never made it to interviews. Like that time in Mexico, on the beach after filming Wrapped, when they didn't speak for hours, only listened to the tide. Like that blurry night at a rap party when she cried for no reason and he just held her. Not because he knew what to say, but because she didn't need him to. He almost turned back, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he wasn't sure he was still worthy of being seen by her. But then she turned, and the look on her face, not shock, not surprise, but something closer to breathless recognition, anchored him there. Neither of them moved for a moment, and the vineyard, the wind, the sky, all seemed to wait too, as if time had pressed pause so the 2 souls that had unfinished business could catch up. "Hi," she said finally. "Hi," he replied, almost a whisper. "You came. I didn't know if I should. I didn't know if you would." That was all it took. No long explanations, no apologies, no rehearsed speeches, just that mutual truth in the air. Fragile, trembling, honest. They walked slowly, side by side, to an old wooden bench beneath a crooked olive tree. The bench wasn't part of the gala setup. It wasn't for guests or speeches or photographs. It was hers, a place she came to sit and think, and it became their place too, just like that. "You look," he started. "I look older," she smiled without flinching. "No," he shook his head gently. "You look real." She looked at him with a flicker of something unsaid, and then she laughed, softly, almost as if her ribs had been holding back that sound for a decade. "Do you remember when we were 25 and you told me love was just timing?" she asked. "Yeah, I was wrong." "No, I think you were right," she replied. "But we just always had terrible timing." He nodded, slowly, and looked out over the vines. I kept thinking I'd bump into you at some airport or some set, or maybe we'd run into each other in line for coffee. But life never put us in the same place again. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. Until now, she said quietly. The sun was melting behind the hills, pouring a warm gold across their skin. He turned to look at her, truly look, not as an actress, not as a colleague, not as a symbol of what-ifs or almosts, but as the woman he had quietly carried in every silent moment of longing, as the only person he'd ever felt fully safe with, without needing to explain who he was, as the maybe he never stopped believing in. Why now, Sandra? Because I got tired of pretending I wasn't still carrying you around inside me. He blinked slowly, the weight of those words settling into his chest like something ancient waking up. And because, she added, her voice slightly trembling, I found something that belonged to you. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small photo, worn at the edges, slightly faded. It was from the set of their first film, the one where they were laughing behind the scenes, candid, caught mid-joke. No glam, no pose, just pure joy. He had lost that photo years ago and thought it was gone for good. But here it was, kept, preserved, protected by her all this time. I always kept it, she whispered. Even when I told myself I had moved on, I never could let it go. His hands trembled slightly as he took it, brushing his fingers across it as if it might vanish like a dream. And then, without warning, his voice cracked. I missed you. I missed you too, she said, barely able to hold back the swell in her eyes, and for the first time in years, they let the silence between them be a home, not a wall. A place where all the unsaid things didn't have to be explained, because they already understood. Two lives tangled across time, finally paused long enough to feel the pull of something deeper than fame, older than time, and stronger than any reason they'd used to stay apart. It was only the beginning, a quiet reunion far away from cameras, award stages, and headlines. But the world would hear of it soon, not because they shouted it, but because something in the way they looked at each other that day, it would echo far louder than words ever could. The years we never spoke. The Vineyard Gala faded into a blur behind them. Voices, footsteps, and laughter scattered through the night air like embers from a slow-burning fire, but none of it reached the bench where Keanu and Sandra sat. They stayed under that crooked olive tree as though the world itself paused just for them. When a staff member approached with a soft, "Ms. Bullock, the guests," she simply smiled and gestured politely toward the crowd. "Let them be," she said. "They came for a cause. Let them find each other. Tonight, I already found mine." And just like that, the night bent around their silence. The stars began rising, slow and deliberate, like old friends crawling back into memory. The scent of earth and ripening grapes mixed with the breeze, and time, once so fast and cruel, now moved like it was asking permission to continue. They didn't rush into conversation. That was never their way. Their bond was never built on noise. It was in the spaces between words, the glances that said more than scripts ever could. She tilted her head and looked at him, not with the curiosity of someone trying to dig up the past, but with the softness of someone finally ready to hold it without fear. "Do you remember," she began slowly, "when we were filming in Prague? That tiny cafe on the corner near the river, where no one recognized us?" He smiled, his eyes still carrying that quiet depth that always made her nervous and calm at the same time. "You made me eat a pastry I couldn't pronounce," he chuckled. "And you made me promise I'd come back there with someone I loved one day." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "And you said you didn't know what that kind of love felt like." Yet, Keanu didn't respond right away. He simply closed his eyes, breathing in the memory like incense. "I still don't," he said, voice lower now. "But I think I might be sitting beside it." That made her chest tighten. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a declaration. It was something much more dangerous. It was truth. The kind of truth that doesn't ask for approval, that simply exists whether one is ready for it or not. And she realized, in that exact moment, that the years they never spoke were not wasted. They were a necessary silence. A season of becoming, of healing wounds that neither was ready to reveal before. All those years, through loss, heartbreak, betrayal, loneliness, raising children, saying goodbye to parents, walking away from toxic contracts, and waking up wondering if they were still seen as human in a world of constant spotlight. Those years shaped the souls that were now finally ready to look at each other without masks. They walked back to the private house behind the vineyard, away from the crowd, down a gravel path lined with lavender bushes and dim string lights. Inside, the living room was quiet, with old jazz playing from a vintage record player and an untouched glass of wine on the table. She poured him one, not because it was expected, but because it felt like the most human thing she could do for him in that moment. Offer something familiar. He took it, not for the taste, but because her hand brushed his and it grounded him. He glanced around the room, noticing the scattered books, the photographs of her children, a half-finished journal lying open with a pen resting across the pages. "You live like you're hiding from the world," he said softly. She smiled. "Not hiding," she replied, "just protecting the parts I still want to keep sacred." He understood that. More than most ever could. Fame wasn't glamorous from the inside. It was isolating. And when you were someone like Sandra, fierce, kind, complex, the world expected you to be everything all the time. But sitting there, cross-legged on the floor in sweatpants and a sweater far too big for her frame, with no makeup, no filters, no rehearsed charm, she was simply herself. And that version of her was more breathtaking than any role she had ever played. He sat across from her, letting the silence settle again. "Why did we wait this long?" he finally asked, not accusingly, but like someone who had just realized he'd been holding his breath for decades. She took a sip from her glass, looking down at the floor. "Because we were too afraid to hurt each other, and too proud to admit we were already hurting without each other." There it was, the heart of it. The fear, the pride, the timing, always the timing. Every time one of them was ready, the other was either healing, grieving, married, filming, running, or simply unsure. They had orbited each other like two stars too afraid to collide. But somewhere in the back of both their minds, they had hoped the gravity would someday pull them close enough again. That night, in that living room, it finally had. "I wrote you once," Keanu confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "It was after your mom died. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what words wouldn't sound empty." She looked up at him, her eyes glassy. "I would have given anything to hear from you back then." "I know," he said, "and I hated myself for not sending it." She reached forward then, placing her hand on his knee. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "We did what we could with the tools we had at the time," she said, echoing something her therapist once told her. "But now we're here, and we're different people. Better, maybe, but at least we're honest now." He held her gaze, the kind of eye contact that makes everything else blur. The music shifted on the record player, a Nina Simone track this time, and something in her posture softened completely. She leaned her head against the couch behind him. "Keanu," she whispered, "can I tell you something I've never said to anyone?" He nodded gently. "Of course," she inhaled slowly. "I was in love with you. During Speed. During Lake House. Even in the years we didn't speak. I think a part of me still was." He didn't respond with words. He didn't have to. He set his glass down, leaned forward, and placed his forehead gently against hers. A moment that wasn't a kiss, but far more intimate than one. The space between them collapsed. Not because of romance, but because of truth. For the first time in years, their souls stopped pretending. No roles, no scripts, no delays. Just two people who had carried an invisible thread between them across decades, now finally sitting still long enough to tie the ends together. The warmth between them grew not with urgency, but with reverence. Because when you've waited a lifetime for a moment, you don't rush it. You cherish every second, and when she began to cry, not loudly, not broken, just silent tears that slid down her cheek without resistance, he did what he had always done instinctively. He held her, fully, without asking why, because sometimes the most powerful love doesn't demand to be understood. It only needs to be honored. They didn't sleep that night. Not in the way the world defines sleep. They sat on the floor, then the couch, then outside under a blanket watching the moon arc across the sky. They talked about everything and nothing, about pain, about poetry, about movies they wish they had done, about children, about the loneliness that fame brings, about the things they never got to say. And for the first time in decades, they both felt seen, not admired, not idolized, seen the way only soulmates do, as if the world disappeared and only their shared heartbeat remained. As the sun began to rise, washing the vineyard in soft pinks and golds, she looked at him and asked softly, "What do we do now?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We don't run this time." And just like that, everything began again. If only the world knew. The days that followed were a quiet symphony. No flashbulbs, no camera crews, no carefully worded statements from agents or stylists curating damage control. Just the soft rhythm of two souls rediscovering what it meant to simply exist in each other's presence. They didn't announce anything. There were no Instagram posts, no cryptic quotes shared online to stir speculation. For once, they didn't need the world to understand what was blooming between them, because for the first time in years, they themselves finally did. Keanu extended his stay in Sonoma without hesitation, canceling a photo shoot he never really wanted to do. Sandra uncharacteristically cleared 3 full days from her calendar, told her assistant not to call unless it was about her children, and left her phone upside down on the kitchen table. They made space, not just in their schedules, but in their hearts. Each morning began slowly. Keanu would make coffee, black and bitter like he liked it, and Sandra would insist on adding a drop of vanilla to hers, always joking that life needed a little sweetness, even if it was pretend. They would sit on the wooden porch outside the vineyard house, watching the fog roll over the hills like an old lover reluctant to leave. Sometimes they would talk about childhood, about grief, about their favorite lines from forgotten books. Other times they said nothing, letting the silence braid itself between them like something sacred. There was no pressure to perform, no need to be charming or interesting, and that perhaps was the rarest gift of all, to be fully oneself, unedited and still chosen. One evening, as the wind picked up and the stars came out bruised with shades of orange and purple, they lit a small fire pit and curled into the same blanket. Keanu stared at the flames, his brow heavy with thought. "You know," he began, voice low and rough like gravel underfoot, "when I lost Jennifer, I told myself I'd never feel anything again. Not deeply, not fully, because it felt like letting love in meant opening the door to devastation." Sandra didn't interrupt. She simply pressed her head against his shoulder, listening with every inch of her being. "But then you'd appear," he continued. "Every few years. A photo, an old interview, a movie we did. And it would hit me like a pulse I thought had stopped. That maybe I hadn't shut the door completely." Sandra exhaled, her breath catching against his chest. "I lost Brian around the same time," she whispered. "I told myself I had to be strong for my kids. That romance was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. But the truth is, I built walls so tall I couldn't even hear my own heart anymore, until you sat across from me that night and looked at me like I was still someone worth waiting for." The fire crackled between them, sparks dancing up into the air like stars trying to return home. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this 6 years ago," she said softly. "It was never meant to be sent. I wrote it after I watched you in that interview. The one where you said the ones we love, they wait for us after we die. It broke me. But in the best way." He took the paper gently, unfolded it, and began to read. Her handwriting was still the same, elegant but imperfect, like poetry written by someone too humble to call themselves a poet. The letter didn't start with "Dear Keanu." It simply began, "Some people pass through your life like seasons. But you've always been the sky, always there, even when I forgot to look up." He didn't make it to the end, not because it wasn't worth finishing, but because the tears welled too quickly. He placed the letter down on his lap, took her hand and kissed the back of it. Slow, reverent, almost like a prayer. And for a long while, neither of them spoke, because some love stories aren't told in dialogue. They're written in gestures, in shared pain, in the courage it takes to return after all seems lost. But even as the quiet cocoon of Sonoma wrapped around them like a warm fog, they both knew this still wasn't real life. Not yet. There would be cameras again, publicists, press junkets, people with microphones asking invasive questions not out of care, but for clicks. And then there were her children, the most important pieces of her world. They didn't know yet, and telling them meant more than a confession. It meant commitment. So, on the fourth evening, as they sat on the back porch and watched her youngest, Layla, chase the family dog across the yard, Sandra turned to Keanu, her face unreadable. "Do you want to meet them properly?" she asked. "Not just as my friend, but as something more." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Only if they're ready. And only if you believe I'm worthy of that role." She looked at him, eyes steady. "They already love you," she said. "They've seen your films. They quote you all the time, but they don't know who you really are to me. And honestly, I think it's time they did." So the next morning, they all went for a walk by the lake. It was a safe place, away from paparazzi, full of trees and ducks and gravel paths. Sandra carried snacks. Keanu carried conversation. He was funny, in that dry, awkward way only he could master. The kids were hesitant at first, but his sincerity was undeniable. He didn't try too hard. He didn't force affection. He listened, asked questions, and laughed. A real laugh. The kind that made Sandra's shoulders relax for the first time in months. Later that afternoon, when the kids had gone inside to watch a movie, Sandra and Keanu stayed behind on the steps, sipping hot tea. "They like you," she said quietly. "I think they might even love you." Keanu looked at her, his voice barely audible. "And what about you?" She turned her head, met his gaze, and whispered the words like they had been living inside her for decades. "I never stopped." That night, Sandra tucked the kids in, kissed their foreheads, and sat beside Keanu under the same tree where this all began. The stars were brighter this time. The air warmer, the future, no longer a distant fog. He pulled something from his jacket pocket. A small silver key. It wasn't to a house. It wasn't to a car. It was to the motorcycle he'd ridden across the country once, years ago, alone. "This key," he said, "has always taken me away from everything. But now, I want it to take me back. Back to you." She took it in her palm, closed her fingers over it, and smiled. "Then let's go home. Not a fairy tale. Not a perfect ending. But the beginning of a love story the world would feel. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. The promise that changed everything." There was a different weight in the air when they returned to Los Angeles. Not heavy like dread, not cold like fear, but thick with a kind of electricity that only comes when life is about to change in irreversible ways. The silence inside Keanu's house wasn't empty the way it used to be. It was warm now, layered with the echo of Sandra's laugh, the memory of her fingertips grazing along his forearm, and the scent of the faint vanilla perfume she always wore when she wasn't trying to impress anyone. It wasn't the Hollywood version of romance people gossiped about online. This was slow, sacred, patient. This was two tired souls finally letting themselves be held without performing strength for the cameras, without playing characters for the world, without apologizing for being human. They sat together on the couch with no TV on, no music playing, just the hum of the city outside and the occasional passing motorcycle rumbling down Sunset Boulevard. There was something grounding about existing together quietly like this, something that felt more intimate than any spotlight moment in their entire careers. Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the blurred city lights flicker through the glass, and whispered something she had never dared to say when she was younger and scared of wanting too much. "This feels like a life I never believed I deserved." Keanu didn't answer immediately. He inhaled slowly, as if gathering fragments of meaning he'd been holding inside his chest for decades, then placed his hand on top of hers. "You deserve every soft thing this world can give. he said gently, "and every soft thing you were denied." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from pain this time, but from being finally spoken to in a language she understood without translation. For so long she had been the strong one, the resilient one, the mother who carried the world on her back and didn't let it show. But with him she didn't need to carry anything. Not her armor, not her wounds, not her defenses. She could just rest. The days blurred into a kind of peaceful rhythm. Coffee together in the kitchen while barefoot. Late-night movie marathons where they didn't finish any film because halfway through they were already talking about life instead of watching it. Slow walks without bodyguards, and dinners where they didn't choose the expensive places but the quiet corners where they could actually hear each other breathe. And little by little they began to reclaim parts of themselves they'd abandoned to survive the industry. Sandra began painting again, something she hadn't done since her 20s. Keanu started writing on an old typewriter. Pages and pages of fragmented thoughts and poems and letters never meant to be sent, but simply meant to breathe. They were not falling in love. They were finally arriving in love. But with love also came responsibility, and the weight of telling people they trusted. Sandra knew she had to tell her closest friends first. She invited 2 of them for brunch at her house on a quiet Sunday, and Keanu joined. At first there was shock, then disbelief, then the kind of emotional silence where you could feel the world shifting in real time. One of them leaned back in her chair and said, almost in a whisper, "It was always supposed to be you two. Everyone could see it, except you two." Sandra looked at Keanu in that moment and realized how long the universe had been trying to deliver them back to each other. How many signs they had ignored. How many near misses could have been moments if fear hadn't been in control. But the true test came when Keanu brought her into his most vulnerable space. The small, hidden away storage loft where he kept everything from his past that mattered more than his career. Inside were boxes filled with handwritten notes, books with highlighted paragraphs, photos with no press value but emotional value beyond calculation. And on one shelf, a small framed picture of them laughing in that behind-the-scenes moment on the set of Speed. It wasn't posed, or retouched, or stylized. It was pure. It was the same photo Sandra had kept for years. He walked over to that frame, took it gently in both hands, and turned to her. "This is the only photo of us I never hid from myself," he said, voice trembling. "Because this is who we were before the world had a claim on us." Sandra stepped closer, placed both hands on his chest, and whispered, "Then let's reclaim who we were, and choose who we become." In the days that followed, they made a vow. Not a romantic proposal, not a scripted promise, but a soul agreement. That this time they would not sabotage their own happiness because of fear, scheduling, or public noise. They would not let guilt pull them back into isolation. They would not treat love like a fragile secret that must be protected from life. Instead, they would treat love like oxygen, something to be breathed daily, something to expand into, something to fight for. And one night, sitting together on the rooftop under the cold silver moon, Keanu took her hands gently and said words she never expected to hear from him, words that didn't need rings or ceremonies to feel more permanent than steel. "I won't run from this anymore. I won't disappear into the shadows again. I am choosing you, every day, even when life gets loud, even when people talk, even when fear tries to convince me I'm safer alone. I'm choosing you." Sandra's breath shook as she pressed her forehead against his, her voice barely audible. "Then I choose you too, in every lifetime, in every version of us that could have existed." They closed their eyes, not because they needed to shut the world out, but because some promises are felt more than spoken, the kind of promises that rewrite destiny itself. And somewhere in that silent vow, in the quiet merging of their souls, the future shifted again. This time not to pull them apart, but to lead them toward the life they never believed they were still worthy of building. The storm and the stillness. The silence between them had become its own language, not a gap in conversation, but a space where meaning could stretch and breathe. They didn't speak to fill it. They let it exist, sacred and whole. And so, when the world inevitably came knocking, demanding answers, explanations, and statements, neither Sandra nor Keanu responded with the rehearsed emptiness that publicists typically issued on their behalf. They simply chose stillness, chose each other, chose the quiet truth over the performance of transparency. But even love, wrapped in silence, is never completely invisible. Not in Hollywood, not in a world trained to devour every whisper about those who live under the shadow of fame. And so the rumors began. Soft at first, like gentle raindrops before a storm. An unnamed source, a blurred photo, a cryptic social post. And then came the tidal wave. Tabloid headlines, trending hashtags, speculative podcasts. Are Keanu and Sandra back together? Secret romance or just friends? Decades later, the truth behind their bond finally revealed. And through it all, they remained. Still, but stillness can be dangerous when you live in a world that feeds on movement. Soon, cameras followed them down sidewalks, drones hovered above Sandra's garden, and journalists began pressing mutual friends for comment. Her children were asked questions at school. His sister received phone calls at work. Even old co-workers from long-retired film sets began receiving requests for insight. What began as love rediscovered now risked becoming love exposed. And so one evening after the 100th call from a news outlet was ignored and her son asked, "Why do people care who you love, Mom?" Sandra stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom and stared at her reflection until the tears finally came. Not tears of shame, not regret, just exhaustion. The kind only known by those who have tried too hard, for too long, to live authentically in a world that punishes honesty. Keanu walked into the room quietly, the way he always did, like a soft apology. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. She closed her eyes, leaned back into him, and whispered, "I'm so tired of hiding and still being hunted." His voice was gentle. "Then let's stop hiding." She turned around slowly, searching his face for fear, but found none. Only clarity, only steadiness. "Are you sure?" she asked, half dreading his answer. But he didn't flinch. "I don't want a love I can only have in the shadows," he said. "I want one I can stand inside, with you, fully, even if it means facing the storm." So they made a decision, not for the world, but for themselves. They wouldn't make an announcement. They wouldn't pose for a magazine cover or stage a joint interview, but they would stop shrinking, stop ducking into alleys and wearing sunglasses indoors. Stop denying the joy they found in each other just because the world wasn't comfortable with people loving quietly. And so, one morning, they walked through a local farmer's market hand in hand. No fanfare, no entourage, just two humans, weathered by time, grief, and grace, daring to walk through the world as though love was not a scandal but a sanctuary. And as expected, the world reacted. Photos were everywhere within hours. Keanu and Sandra, it's official. Decades in the making, their love story unfolds. Comment sections exploded. Some were beautiful. Messages from fans who had always secretly hoped, from people inspired by the possibility of second chances, from those who saw in their story the quiet truth that real love does not rush or demand spectacle. Others were cruel, accusing them of PR stunts, of midlife desperation, of rewriting history. But none of that reached them, because while the world buzzed with noise, they were living in the stillness beneath it. That stillness became even more precious when Sandra received the call, the kind that shifts your center of gravity without warning. Her sister had fallen ill. It wasn't sudden, but it was serious. A slow, aggressive form of cancer. She would need help. Not just emotional, but practical, day-to-day support. And so Sandra packed a bag, cleared her calendar, and flew to Austin, where her sister lived just outside the city in a modest home with tall grass, wind chimes, and the faint hum of old country songs playing through open windows. Keanu didn't ask for permission. He simply showed up 3 days later, unannounced, with groceries, a bag of books, and that same quiet presence that never demanded space but filled it completely when needed most. He cooked, he mowed the lawn. He sat beside Sandra in hospital waiting rooms and brought coffee with just the right amount of sugar when she couldn't keep her eyes open. He didn't fix things. He didn't try to save her. He just stayed, present, patient, and profoundly dependable. And in those quiet, heavy weeks, Sandra realized something she had never allowed herself to fully admit until then. This wasn't just love. This was the kind of partnership most people die never experiencing. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, earned, forged in fire, held with reverence. One night, after her sister had fallen asleep and the Texas stars had filled the sky with their indifferent beauty, Sandra and Keanu sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, shoulders touching. She looked at him, truly looked, and asked the question that had lived quietly behind her ribs for months. "Do you ever wish we'd figured this out sooner?" He took a long breath, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "because I don't think we would have lasted if we had. We weren't ready back then. But now we know what it costs to love someone fully. And we're willing to pay that price." She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Not from sadness, from truth. And that night, in a small kitchen in Austin, with no audience and no applause, Keanu reached into his pocket and placed something on the table between them. It wasn't a ring, not yet. It was a photograph. The same one they both had kept over the years. But this one was different. Behind it, scribbled in his careful, shaky handwriting, were 7 words. "Let's stop surviving love. Let's start living it." She picked it up, held it to her chest, and whispered, "Yes," not to a proposal, not to a timeline, but to the life they were already building. Imperfect, vulnerable, beautiful. And somewhere in the silence between them, the universe exhaled. The love that waited. The seasons passed slowly, almost reverently, as though time itself understood that what it was witnessing between Sandra and Keanu was not just a romance, but a rare unfolding, a return of something once thought lost to fate. Winter melted gently into spring. Her sister, while still fragile, found moments of peace. The kids, once uncertain, now looked at Keanu with an unspoken trust, as though they'd always known he'd find his way to their family. Just a little late, but right on time. And in the quiet corners of that Texas house, between home-cooked meals, quiet music playing in the background, and long walks where words weren't always needed, a new kind of life began to take shape. Not the kind made for Hollywood scripts, but the kind that roots itself in honesty, in choosing to stay when it's hard, in building something gentle in a world that worships the loud. Sandra had always been strong, the kind of woman who didn't wait around to be saved, the kind who carried grief with grace and wore exhaustion like a second skin. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to lean, to rest, to be loved not for her resilience, but for her softness. Keanu became her quiet place, her reminder that home wasn't a location, but a presence, one that steadied her when the world tilted and held her in the in-between. He never made grand declarations. He didn't write speeches or rehearse perfect lines. He simply showed up, every day, without needing to be asked. And sometimes that was the loudest kind of love. One morning, while the kids were at school and the house was silent except for the hum of the old fridge, Sandra found him in the backyard, sitting barefoot on the wooden steps with a mug of coffee and a notepad in his lap. He was sketching, not something for a role, not something to sell, just lines, swirls, little fragments of beauty with no audience in mind. She sat beside him, took his hand in hers, and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think love meant urgency," she whispered. "That if it wasn't fireworks and chaos and grand passion, then it wasn't real." He smiled without looking up. "And now?" She exhaled slowly, watching the wind move through the tall grass. "Now I know love can feel like exhaling, like coming home." The idea of marriage had never been something either of them chased. They'd both been shaped by loss, by disappointment, by the kind of grief that rewires a person's ability to dream of permanence. But with each passing day, permanence no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a blessing. And one rainy afternoon, while they were sitting on the couch under a blanket watching an old French film neither of them understood fully, Keanu reached over, pulled a tiny velvet pouch from his pocket, and placed it in her hand without a word. She opened it slowly, expecting a ring. But it wasn't a ring. It was a single vintage house key, polished and worn at the edges. He spoke quietly, almost nervously. "This is the key to the cottage in Maui, the one I bought years ago but never lived in. I always told myself I'd only go there when I was ready to stop running, to build something instead of burying things. It's been sitting there empty, waiting. Kind of like my heart, I guess." Sandra didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked at the key, then at him, then back at the key. She closed her hand around it and nodded, eyes full of tears, voice steady and clear. "Then let's go home." A few weeks later, they boarded a flight with no announcement, no press, no headlines. Just them. 2 carry-ons, a dog, and a map of the stars they hadn't looked at in years. The Maui air welcomed them like an old lullaby, warm, fragrant, forgiving. The cottage sat near the water, surrounded by palm trees that swayed like they were whispering stories from lifetimes past. Inside it was simple. Wooden floors, worn rugs, a piano with a chipped key. They spent their first few nights sleeping with windows open, listening to waves crash like a heartbeat outside. And every morning, Keanu would make her tea, and she'd read aloud from whatever book was closest. And they'd begin the day not as celebrities, not as survivors, but simply as 2 people who had finally found what the world had nearly robbed them of: peace. One evening, just as the sky turned gold and pink over the Pacific, the kids flew in with her sister, and the house burst to life with laughter and running feet and half-burned marshmallows. They had a small dinner on the porch. No speeches, no toasts, just love. Pure and wide and unfiltered. And when the night deepened, when the stars returned to take their places above, Sandra stood up, walked to Keanu and said simply, "I'm ready." He stood too, reached into his back pocket. This time it was a ring, simple, silver, no stone, a symbol, not a trophy. She held out her hand. No one clapped, no music played. But something eternal shifted in that moment, as though the universe once again held its breath just to witness a truth finally fulfilled. They were married the next day under a tree that had stood for over a century. The ceremony was small. Her children, his closest friend. Her sister, a local pastor. No gowns, no tuxedos. She wore a white linen dress and walked barefoot. He wore a black shirt, open at the collar with a small chain around his neck that held a locket with his mother's picture. When the pastor asked if they vowed to walk beside one another, through what was left of this life, through storms and stillness, through whatever time would offer, they didn't answer with words. They simply held each other's gaze and nodded. That night, they danced in the living room with the windows wide open and the ocean wind playing through the curtains like a symphony composed just for them. No photographers, no choreographed moments, just bodies swaying slowly, quietly, in a room filled with candlelight and the scent of gardenia. And when Sandra finally rested her head on Keanu's chest, she whispered, "We made it." He kissed the top of her head and whispered back, "No, love. We finally began, and that was the truth. This was not an ending, not the closing scene of a movie, not a neat bow wrapped around a love story for public consumption. This was the start of something real, something sacred, something earned, because some love stories don't shout. They wait, quietly, patiently, like old songs playing in the background of life, waiting for the moment someone dares to stop, listen, and finally sing along. And in that house by the sea, under the witness of stars and memory and time itself, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves did just that. They didn't just fall in love. They stayed.